Rushton. I'm the co-chair of the Johns Hopkins Ethics Committee and faculty member of the Institute of Bioethics. Welcome to Ethics for Lunch, co-sponsored by the Ethics Committee and the Johns Hopkins Hospital and the Berlin Institute of Bioethics. We are thrilled today to have a really wonderful panel to speak to us about an issue that I'm sure people have lots of questions about, and I'm sure we're going to hear some very interesting ideas about how we should think about genetic testing. This is part of our monthly Ethics for Lunch series. It's an opportunity for us to come together as a community around issues that are of concern, and we are really happy to have Debra Mathews, Lori Irby, and Anna Hamish. Debra will introduce the panel, and the topic, which is direct-to-consumer genetic testing, what's in it for you? Prevent.
Yes. Thank you very much. So the way this is going to work is first, Pete's going to come up here to help me with a little bit of live polling. So if you get out your phones, if you want to participate in the live poll, all it requires is some texting, and Pete will give you instructions in just a second. And just to say, I think we'll all introduce ourselves a little bit more, but you have 3 flavors of genetics folks up here. I have a PhD in genetics, but I do ethics and policy. Lori is a genetic counselor, and Ada is a medical geneticist. So 3 sort of different perspectives coming at this same area of genetics in the marketplace. So I think we'll start with the poll. So we'll start the polling. We're going to start with 2 questions now, and then there'll be 2 questions after I'm done talking, and then 2 questions after Lori and Ada talk.
Okay, do all of you have your phones out? If you could, please text JHHEFL to 37607, and that will link you into our...
Is there a way to, because my slides are up? Alan, do you know how to project this?
It should be
not
projected
showing.
if you want to toggle it was.
But we want to be able to show the results. Oh, right. We're going to get it up on the screen here. Sorry about that. There it is.
All right. Okay, and once again, text JHHEFL to 37607.
And it's right up there at the top.
Also listed at the top. And then
So the question is, have you sent a sample to a direct-to-consumer genetic testing company like 23andMe or Ancestry? You can't hear, sorry. The question is, have you sent a sample to a direct-to-consumer genetic testing company like 23andMe or Ancestry.com? Yes, no, or not yet, but I'm seriously considering it. Alive.
oh, look at that. That's exciting.
This is the most high-tech thing I've ever done in my life. Okay, we'll give folks another like 10 seconds, and then we're gonna color it on. So it's been pretty consistent that about a quarter of the folks who have responded to the poll have done this. Most of you have not. and about a fifth of you haven't yet are seriously considering it. It would be interesting to do this again after you hear our talk about this and see if there's a change. All right, second question, and then I'll give my little spiel. So the second question is, if you have used one of these companies, so there's 24% of you who have used one of these, sent a sample to one of these companies, or are seriously considering it, what was or is your primary reason for doing it? Is it ancestry information, medical information, find genetic relatives, or something else? So I don't know about you all, but we are finding this really interesting. All right, so most people who have done this, have done it for, or thinking about it, is for reasons of ancestry, interest in their ancestry. Again, about a quarter of folks for medical information, and 13% for some other reason. All right, so I'm going to try to stay very close to the mic. Excellent, okay. So, the case that was distributed with the announcement for the panel today talked about 23andMe, but there are other companies that have existed and continue to exist. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm going to talk briefly about the science and what two of these companies in particular, 23andMe and Origin, are currently offering. So I'm sorry you missed this, but last week there was a special going on at 23andMe. Say it with saliva. They actually put that on their website. You could get 20% off a kit for your honey for Valentine's Day to see if you are genetically matched. To learn more about each other through your DNA. You may have also heard of Origin Genomics. You can get your superhero DNA test from Origin. They became quite famous, well, genetic famous, in Baltimore last fall because there was going to be a Ravens DNA Day offer where they would hand out free kits for you to spit in during the game and then deposit in bins that they would have around the stadium so that basically you could donate your DNA to them. They said they would give you 4 free genetic test results. So we will come back to both of those companies in just a minute. So the way these companies generally work is that you purchase a kit, collect a sample. It's usually spit or a cheek swab, or sometimes you can also submit blood. 23andMe used to advertise spit parties. And they're mostly doing genotyping. There's one company that's now doing whole exome sequencing, which I will come back to, but they're mostly doing genotyping. So what does genotyping mean? And apologies to the geneticists in the room. So in your cells, in the nucleus, is your genome. Your genome is packaged into, is the mic going in and out? Okay, sorry. Your DNA is packaged in chromosomes. You have 23 pair of chromosomes.
in your chromosomes is your DNA, which is where your genes are. And the genes are the instruction booklet, right? And each gene is made up of base pairs. And each gene, you get a copy from mom and a copy from dad. Okay, you have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Copy from mom, copy from dad. So we all have, for example, the BRCA1 gene. We all have it. Just most of us don't have mutations in the BRCA1 gene that cause cancer. We all have breast cancer gene. In fact, we all have 2 copies of it. So what most of these companies do is genotyping, which means they're looking at particular places on the genome. They're not looking at your entire genome. They're looking at SNPs. So all of us in this room share the vast majority of our DNA. We're well over 99% the same in our DNA. But the places where we're different, is this as distracting for you? The places where it's different, that's what these companies are looking at. Some of those places. They're looking at SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Places where, see, we have vast majority of that is the same. Is this on? Let's try this though. So the vast majority of our DNA is the same. But here, for example, one person has a C and another person has a T. Or this could be, you got a C from your mom and a T from your dad. So what these companies are doing is looking to see whether you have a C or a T there. Right? And this applies to many places across the genome. They do this mostly using DNA chips, which is, this is a very, very old one. People who are in this world will laugh at this. They are looking at only a whole bunch of those single spots. Okay? Now I'm going to ask Lori to come up, because I've stolen the next set of slides from a talk Lori gives in my class. So I'm going to ask her to run through the kinds of data they're getting from these single spots in your genome.
And I'm going to give you sort of the 50,000-foot overview just to give you a sense of what these data are actually telling you. I'm not going to go into too many details about it. But we understand what these individual spots in the genome might mean for traits or diseases by investigating how they run through populations and how they might be associated with certain traits or certain conditions. And they do this generally through what we call genome-wide association studies. So there have been many different genome-wide association studies in the last 10 to 20 years. And many findings. One important thing to keep in mind is that not all genome-wide association studies find consistent evidence. So we have conflicting evidence about what any individual spot might be linked to in terms of traits and conditions. But what a scientist has to do is try to take all of this together and figure out, are there any spots that actually have enough data for us to figure out what they might mean or how they might associate. So in general, what happens in a genome-wide association study is that you have a large case control study. So cases being, these are people who have a particular condition of interest, controls being people who are similar in many ways, but they don't have the same condition of interest. And so they take the 2 groups of people and they look at all those individual spots in the genome that we think might differ between populations and see whether there are differences between the cases and the controls in terms of how often you see a C versus a T. So that's on very basic level what they're doing. So as I said, there's these SNPs, or these single nucleotide polymorphisms across, and they're looking at how they differ between the 2 groups. And they try to determine, extrapolate from that case control study to what might this mean in terms of the whole population by looking at how the C's and the T's in that population might compare to how frequently we see a C or a T in big studies of big populations. So there's these large databases, there are now many of them. In class I talk about the International HapMap project, because that's been around for a long time, but there are many of these databases now, and they have differing differing populations. And so many of these might focus on largely Caucasian populations, but there are databases that are more enriched for African populations. But none of these databases are perfect and cover the entire world's population quite well. So it matters what population is part of the database that you're comparing to. So they'll take what they get out of the case control study and they'll say, how does this compare to what we'd expect the prevalence of these to be in broad populations based on these databases? And then they calculate, and you can, based on a case control study, you can calculate an odds ratio, which basically just says, let's look at the odds of having condition or trait A. If you have a C, the odds of having that trait versus not having that trait, if you have a C, over the odds of having that trait or condition over not having the trait or condition if you have a T. And they calculate that odds ratio, and they can say, oh look, it's an association. It looks like you're more likely to have heart disease if you have a C versus if you have a T. And that tells us a lot that's interesting scientifically, but it doesn't really tell us very much about any individual's risk of having heart disease if they have a C versus a T. So there are some manipulations that you have to make and some assumptions that you have to make in order to get from that odds ratio to an actual individual's possible risk. In addition, a lot of the GWAS studies beyond the GWAS will do refinement, they'll do a replication, they'll try it over again and see if they see the same proportions in different populations. They'll do functional studies of that particular part of the genome to try to get a better sense. This is all in terms of enhancing our science, but it still doesn't necessarily lead us to exactly what is an individual's risk. So in order to get to an individual's risk, what you really want as a genetic counselor or as a person trying to counsel somebody is not an odds ratio, but a relative risk. The relative risk is what is your probability of having heart disease if you have a C over your probability of having heart disease if you don't have a C. So that's what we're trying to get to. And the case control study doesn't give you that exactly. It can give you some approximation of that. And that's as far as I'm going to go into that for now. But that just so you know, it's not a perfect correlation back from one to the other.
Right. I mean, I think one of the main messages we want to give you is that the data that they are using to give you a personal result is based on population level data, not on you specifically. And that is a really important distinction. So what do they say they're giving you? So 23, or what are they offering you rather? 23andMe has been around for quite some time now. They went through a period of time when the FDA said, no, actually you're not allowed to do any of that. And they got shut down for a while, but they started returning health results again last year. They offer in their $199 test, that was 20% off for Valentine's Day. They're also, if you've been watching the Olympics, they've been advertising during the Olympics as well. And I noticed looking at some of the other websites, they don't explicitly say the Olympics, but they're like ski jumpers on the front page of their websites right now. So they're they're definitely using the Olympics as a advertising tool. So 23andMe offers ancestry plus genetic health risks. What, I see this again?
Yes, also
I printed out all the many, this is 4 pages of stuff they say they're giving you. So genetic health risks include, for example, risks for celiac disease, hereditary thrombophilia, late onset Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. Their wellness reports include, for example, alcohol flush reaction, which if you've ever drank, you already know the answer to that question. Whether you can get deep sleep. Lactose intolerance, again, if you've ever eaten a lovely cheese, you know the answer to that question. Sleep movement. Traits include asparagus odor detection. Again, you know. Back hair, if you're a guy.
probably know that too.
Yeah, probably no. Eye color, freckles, hair curliness, sweet taste preference, toe length ratio, for example, wellness reports. Carrier status, they give you over 40, carrier status for over 40 conditions, including cystic fibrosis, familial dysautonomia, hereditary fructose intolerance, and many, many others. And then finally, for traits, oh, I don't have traits here. Oh, that was the back hair, etc. All right. They do say, they go to great lengths to tell you that these are now FDA approved for use, including their collection kit, the thing you spit into, and their genotyping. It's manufactured in accordance with FDA's good manufacturing practice regulations, etc. But I have to tell you, it's hard to figure out exactly what they're doing. For me, who's a geneticist, it is hard to figure out exactly what these companies are doing. Although 23andMe is one of the more above board companies, to be sure. And they have gotten dramatically better from what they were like prior to being shut down by FDA briefly. In contrast, Origin, which is the one who offers your hero DNA tests and was offering genetic testing, wanted to offer genetic testing at a Ravens game, where, by the way, you were giving up rights to your DNA. They have revised their privacy rules since getting that shut down by state and federal authorities. You'll be happy to know that the state and federal authorities said you can't actually con people out of the rights to their own DNA. They also offer this child development test. So for episodic memory, there's one mutation they're looking at, language ability. Can your kids learn languages especially well? This is my favorite, learning ability. They're looking at chromosome 6. There's a lot of DNA there. I have no idea what they're testing. Their math ability, they're looking at one mutation. Memory, verbal, numerical, reasoning, and memory. They're looking at one gene. Fitness, health, is your child better at resisting the stomach flu? They are telling you that these are things that you can test for and know about your children from their DNA. Ancestry.com does not give medical information. They are looking at Ancestry. They are using SNPs, like we've discussed before, although they have been thinking about going to whole genome sequencing. Geno 2.0, which is a project of National Geographic. They are now partnering with Helix, which is a private DNA testing firm, for $199, and they are actually doing whole exome sequencing. So they are now looking at all of the DNA in the parts of the genes that actually code for proteins. I don't know when they switched to this.
With what read depth?
With what? That's an excellent question.
Because if you don't really read all the way down, you just as likely to have an error as anything real.
True statement. But again, it's hard to figure out exactly what they're doing. I went to Helix's website, and it's hard to figure out what they're actually doing. So there are many ethical issues here, and we can talk about all of them. There are questions of informed consent. Do folks who are ordering these tests actually know what they're getting into? Do they know who's going to own their DNA in the end? Who owns the data? What's going to happen to it? What kind of testing is actually being done? And what the meaning of the results they're getting back is. And I mean, I'm not against all direct-to-consumer genetic testing at all. I think it can be really empowering for some people. I think it can be entertainment. But I want people to understand what they're paying for and what's happening to their data. Questions of privacy and confidentiality. Right, with that Origin Ravens DNA Day, origin, at that time, they have now changed. They now say everywhere that the default is to opt out of research. When they first offered this last fall, if you could initially opt out of research, but then they keep asking you, do you want to do it now? Do you want to do it now? And then if you say yes, you can never revoke that permission. The meaning of the test results we've already talked about. Who can order for whom, right? You can order the child development tests for your kids. Who owns the data, which I already talked about, and then access. If these get good enough that they provide meaningful medical information and insurance doesn't cover access, how does that affect people's access to genetic information about themselves? All right, Pete, can we do 2 more questions?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Did you say question?
Oh, no, I was going to do polling questions, but
And then
How good are they at determining ancestry?
how good are they?
Hold the bottom of that.
They're actually pretty good at determining ancestry. It's just that your ancestry might not be what you think it is, and your relatedness to other people might not be what you think it is, so you just need to know that. If that's your question going in, you'll get the answer that you may or may not have been expecting. If that wasn't, you were doing it for fun, and it turns out your father's not Penobscot Indian, they're Italian, meaning that the person you think is your dad is not your dad, that's a problem. So, which is a story that's real that I know about. So, it's just, they can do it, and they can do it very well. It's a lot of fun if you're doing it for fun, but you have to know that the relationships you think you understand in your family may not be what they are.
The other thing I'd add to that, and correct me if I'm wrong, so my parents did this because they were really interested, and I will say just anecdotally, they were a little disappointed, not just because it wasn't what they thought, but also because we're largely European, and it didn't really, it didn't give them the story that they were looking for. I think it didn't say, you're from this part of Ireland, or it's sort of, you have a lot of North,
But then it's getting better.
It is getting
They're getting
better.
narrower and narrower, so they can, depending on which test you do, you can sometimes say you're from, County Cork versus, this county. But it depends on what test you do and how much you pay for it and so on. We in genetics can answer to that degree. I'm not sure whether these tests do it yet, but, so you can get that answer to some extent.
But again, it's based on population level data.
Yes, but the amount of population data that you have is such that you really can narrow it. Yeah.
Okay, so this question that people are answering, who should own the data of the people who purchase these services? No one thinks the company should. Most people think both the company and the consumer should own the data. That's interesting. It might end up about half and half. Can we do the last question, then we'll go to... I have to say, I'm a little bit surprised that both the person and the company won that one. I want to talk about that. Be prepared. Okay, putting cost aside, would you consider submitting for testing the sample of a minor in your family? So most people are going to say no, but some people still would be very interested in that. Lori?
Yes. Okay, so a little bit more about who I am. So as Debra said, I'm a genetic counselor, and I direct the genetic counseling training program here at Hopkins jointly with the National Human Genome Research Institute. So I'm actually currently seeing very few patients myself one every 8 weeks or so to keep myself in the game. But I spend a lot of time with our students and our trainees who are really on the ground with this level. And I also spend a lot of time engaging with my colleagues who are thinking about these issues quite frequently. And I will say up front that in the genetic counseling community, this has been quite a difficult topic. The idea of direct-to-consumer testing has been a controversial one from the outset, but controversial in the sense not just that we all come down in the same place with regard to this. So increasingly, as companies have been becoming more and more sophisticated, many of them have actually started to employ genetic counselors. So many people with my training now work for these companies and are working, I think, very sincerely trying to improve the services the companies are offering and improving the ways in which patients are being protected by them. But that also, it does present a conflict a bit in terms of thinking about what does the company need versus what does the consumer need. There are also a number of us who feel quite concerned about wanting to make sure we're protecting patients in the sense of making sure that they're being able to get the information they need to make the best decisions for themselves. I mean, at the heart of it, genetic counselors are about helping facilitate informed decisions around how one moves forward with their genetic information. And to the extent to which any of these companies are not providing the amount of information about the limitations of the testing, about the intentions of the testing, about what the testing can and can't really tell you about you personally, we would be concerned about that. So one of the things I've been looking a lot toward is the extent to which any kind of medical service is being provided on top of the direct-to-consumer piece. So I see the advantage of the direct-to-consumer platform, which is that it potentially has the ability to increase access to genetic information and increasing people's ability to, as Debra said, be empowered by this information if the information is in fact clinically valid and useful to people and people understand that. But it's making sure that people have the information they need to really be able to understand whether the testing is right for them, and then at the back end, understand what the results actually mean and don't mean, and whether they could actually make actionable decisions based on that. Because again, empowerment implies that you can actually do something with it. So if you don't know what to do with them and you feel paralyzed, then it's not empowering anyone. So I thought I'd provide a couple of anecdotes. Again, I said I'm not seeing patients a lot myself these days, but even in the little bit of patient time that I get, has this come up? So I have had, sitting at the NIH, occasionally people will find their way to me saying, I'm desperate, trying to find somebody who will help me interpret this report. I can't find a genetic counselor anywhere. You're working at the NIH, can't you help me? And I've gotten several requests in the last couple of years where people have said, I've got a 23andMe report. I really don't understand what it means for my family. And I can't find a genetic counselor who can talk it over with me. And that's a real problem because genetic counselors aren't sure that this should be their job. And they don't have a lot of time. There is a workforce shortage of genetic counselors, and they're trying to do work for people who are actually at risk for things, and they have a 6-month waiting list to see the patients they need to see and can't fit this person in. But at the same time, these people are real people with real results that they're worried about and not sure how to act on them. So this is an ongoing problem, and I've seen the iceberg of the evidence of that. I also had a patient that I did see for counseling last year who was primarily contacting me because she had a family history of Alzheimer's disease and was trying to figure out whether genetic testing would be helpful for her in terms of planning for her own future. So her childbearing years were over. She was just trying to figure out, where do I want to live in my retirement? Do I want to live in a rural setting or an urban setting? Or how should I be thinking about what my care might need to look like? And I'm curious, she knew she had a parent who had Alzheimer's disease relatively early, and possibly several other family members. So her family history was suggestive that this could be a strong factor in her family. So she was trying to figure out whether genetic testing would help her. And she told me, before coming to me, that she had considered buying the test on 23andMe for ApoE. And at the end of our conversation, when we had genetic counseling, we realized I'm really glad I didn't do that, because in fact that wouldn't have given me any of the information that I was actually looking for. And this woman actually opted ultimately not to have any genetic testing. And we spent a lot of time talking about how she makes decisions in her life without that information. But had she not found her way to me, what would she have done? What could she have ended up with, and what would that have meant in her life? So I think for me, the thing that that's most important is just thinking about how we make sure people have the information that they need, the access to genetic counseling or other people who are informed enough to help you make sense of your results. And so 23andMe does not offer genetic counseling as part of their service, and there aren't many genetic counselors who are prepared to talk. through those. There are a couple now who I know have gone into this particular field and have said, find me online and I will mostly do this kind of counseling, but they're few and far between. And then for companies, there are some now who actually are offering genetic counseling as part of their service. Is that happening up front to help people make decisions about whether the testing is appropriate for them, or is it happening on the back end? Is the counseling offered is it a voluntary thing, or do you have to meet with somebody? What happens to the people who don't end up meeting with somebody? So these are all questions that I think through.
Okay, I'm not even sure where to begin. I think I'm more interested in your questions than my comments, but I'm going to make a couple of very brief comments. The first is that the new version of 23andMe with the specific variants that they're looking at is much cleaner and more thought out. Before, what they would do is they did a whole bunch of panels and they would say, you have a fourfold risk of, let's say, hypertension. And this number is wrong, but and population risk was 1 in 5,000. Well, fourfold of 1 in 5,000 is still not a very high risk. Like, please do not lose sleep over this. But it wasn't clear. And the problem with risk is it is unbelievably personal. So some people see a 25% risk of a problem as the end of the world, and some people see a 25% risk of a problem as 75% risk of no problem. And you really need to have a conversation to figure out where somebody's coming from and what this means to them. And that's why genetic counseling is so important and so important up front, because the implication, you have to think through the implications, but if you've never thought about these things, it's very helpful to talk through. So at least what they're looking at now is narrower, although I don't know that anyone needs to know ApoE4, and in the context of a strong family history of early onset Alzheimer's disease, ApoE4 is not necessarily the gene you want to be looking at, and that's another conversation. So the other caveat, general caveat about 23andMe specifically, their carrier rate, so they can report a carrier, but they cannot report if they find somebody who has both of those variants. They report out unable to give a result. And you have to be smart enough to think, oh, maybe I actually have this problem. Now, most people won't think about that, although some might. So that has happened, actually, with hereditary fructose intolerance, which is incredibly rare, like incredibly rare. But this particular human being had it and was 75 years old and just never ate fruit and figured it out. Very smart guy. But they did not report it. The other thing, which is not medical at all, is that yes, perhaps you think you and the company should own the DNA, but that company now has your DNA. It has the test they ran, and it potentially has whatever else it wants to run if you've said they can. And many people just say they can. So the good news for 23andMe is that I think they're up to close to 10 million DNA samples. They have more of a bioread repository than anybody in the world, and they can do all kinds of cool research. But the other side is they don't actually have very good phenotyping of the patients that have submitted that information. So the conclusions they can draw may be quite limited by that. And then the other side of it is that they've been doing this over quite a period of time, and the validity of the test that they've done is not 100%. So both of those are huge caveats to even what's coming out of this, and it requires verification in other ways. So from my perspective, and I have not done this, and I would not do any of these things, but I can certainly understand the idea of looking for ancestry. I think that would be fun and cool. I want to know what they're going to do with my sample afterwards and what else they're doing with this, because they got my DNA now. But from a medical perspective, I do not think that this is a way to go forward with direct-to-consumer, because if you really don't know where that person's coming from and what they're going to do with that information. So if you had a BRCA1 variant on it, you thought, okay, well, I've done this, I'm not going to get breast cancer, absolutely not true. And you have to know that. And if you don't know it, you're walking around blithely happy about something. Oh, I don't even need my mammograms, and that's not good. So that's my concern about it. I just don't think it's at all ready for anything medical, no matter what the FDA thinks. But this is Autumn Hamish's opinion. Okay.
Would you talk about the CF?
Oh yeah, yes. So one of the things that Debra mentioned 23andMe now is offering, and it's approved by the FDA to offer, is the carrier testing. So you saw on there that they do, I think, 40 different diseases. And it's really important to recognize the difference between what 23andMe is doing, and doing in a way that's actually scientifically, well, from a lab technical standpoint, valid. And what you might get if you were to go see a genetic counselor and ask for CF carrier screening or carrier screening for any one of those other 40 conditions. And the difference is that what they're doing is looking at a couple of specific pathogenic variants on those genes, those 40 genes, that are known in particular populations to be a problem in terms of developing cystic fibrosis or whatever the condition is that they're in question. So there are real pathogenic variants that they're looking for, but they're a limited set. And so if you are a Caucasian and you're looking for cystic fibrosis carrier screening, this is a pretty decent set of pathogenic variants to be looking for and can give you some decent information about your carrier status, although not complete information about your carrier status by any means. But if you're an African American who's interested in that, it's going to give you nothing, essentially nothing. Much less, yeah, essentially nothing. So it's important to understand the limitations of those. And they say them on their website. They do say, we're just looking at these 23 or 28 variants. But if you're not an informed consumer and you don't know what the limitations of only looking for those 28 variants are, and given your own demographic background, then that's a major problem. Is that what you mean?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so for example, in their genetic health risk reports for age-related macular degeneration, they say relevant for European descent. For alpha-1 deficiency, relevant for European descent. Same for celiac disease and hereditary hemochromatosis and hereditary thrombophilia. So the information isn't as broadly applicable as one would hope it would be. And again, you just need to be really clear about what they're offering you when you submit your sample. So, along with Ada, I'm very interested in the questions you all have. So I'd love to have a conversation about, not only about the joint ownership of the data, which I'm super interested to hear how people feel about that, but also the questions of access and the meaning of the data to individuals and families, etc.
Do the companies give you access to your raw data also, or do they only give you this results report?
Could you say it again for people in the back?
Yeah, I was wondering if the companies give you access to your raw data also, or just this results report that's kind of the executive?
So that's going to vary from company to company. I know 23andMe, for at least for a while, was giving you access to all the raw data. I don't know what they're doing now. So I know there was a time when you could get your raw data, and there were actually companies that had popped up who would say, for $10, I'll interpret your data for you, even though 23andMe hasn't. Yeah.
Ancestry also will give you your raw data, and you can put it through, even though they don't do any help things, you get your raw data from them, and you can put it through these third-party software, which, as you say, is like $5 or $10, and they'll give you your BRCA1 results. They gave me my all-time client ECOE results before 23andMe was allowing that, and certainly don't have the sort of counseling services. They just feed out your basic data, and if there's something odd, they'll say, oh, you know, this might be concerning to some people, and here's a link to a support group online. And that's the extent of what they give you.
And the FDA has said that raw genetic data is not medical information, so they are not regulating access to those data.
So I had a quick question about the provisions laid out in the agreement, essentially, where you're allowing the company then to own that information potentially. Is there anything else that's included about if that data is sold to Genentech or to another company where they could make a product from that, or some sort of a discrete assay or something where you do not have any ability to make any kind of a claim for financial reward for that?
So all of these companies have incredibly long documents of the sort I'm sure you can imagine. I don't know them all in detail. I did because I was curious about whether Origin had changed their privacy agreement. It still says that these data can be used for can be sold for advertising and other activities.
It's theirs. Oh, he's going back. Oh, okay. Well, one back and then okay.
It seems like for a while there's just big money in this. I have a comment. I think that the resonance is because there's a fear that if you get genetic testing, what if the insurance companies find out and you get labeled with whatever, and the perceived privacy and relatively low cost, and with all this genomic information out there, people talking, and so I think that's, you know, when I think, well, how did this happen? But when you think about Epic, you know, if something gets into Epic, you can't get it out. And if you're trying to get long-term insurance, you have to say, you know, check off, do you have knowledge of whatever, or may we have at it? And I think people feel like information's power, and it's power that they're getting that the insurance companies don't have. And so I think that's what's muddied the waters, and it's going to take time for people to find out, you know, the consequences of this. But I think that's, I've often thought about this aspect of it.
And originally, again, Origin, when Raven's DNA Day happened, they were very clear that you had to give your proper name and all sorts of personal information to the company. I don't know now if there's some leeway for anonymous samples being submitted, but.
So one of the familiar problems with research, ethical problems in research, is the therapeutic assumption on the part of patients that the research program that they're volunteering for is somehow going to help them. Even that is under the auspices of an IRB and under fairly controlled conditions, whereas here we have really a commercial venture. And I expect that there must be certain expectations and, implicit assumptions on the part of consumers, people who are signing up for these programs. I wonder how much we know about that. What do we know about the people who want to be tested? What are they assuming about these companies? What are they assuming they're going to get? And what sort of level of trust and protection are they assuming that they will be provided? Do we have any information about that? Have there been any studies, or do you have some anecdotal thoughts about that?
So there have been some studies. The main caveat is that many of the studies that have been done are, as is true, many research studies focused on a very specific segment of the population. So it does suggest that people understand the benefits and the purpose of the testing fairly well. And the people who have signed up for testing, typically through these DTC companies, tend to understand the purpose and the benefits fairly well, not as well the risks and limitations. So that part of the informed consent part is lacking, even among the select population that is fairly well informed, fairly well educated. Most of those studies haven't focused on people with lower educational backgrounds, which aren't people who are currently getting DTC testing, but if you think about expanding this to a model of this is the way people get access to testing relatively inexpensively, one could imagine this, especially as it moves to the Ravens game, that this is going to hit a broader segment of the population potentially. We know very little about what their perceptions and expectations will be. I can say we did a qualitative study, this is maybe 6 or 7 years ago now, here in East Baltimore, where we attempted to understand what would people sort of take as the take-home messages, and we had them sit down and play around with the 23andMe website and another competitor at that point that doesn't exist any longer. And this was before the website had been improved, so it was, and what we found was that people with lower educational status largely expected this to be more deterministic information than it was, which is not a surprising result, but it is what we were hearing.
So I'll add two things, one of which is, as you noted, back before, right? These companies are all evolving very, very quickly. So any data you get on perceptions is going to be sort of out of date very quickly because what the companies are doing changes. Like, we can't even keep up with what they're doing. I will say that on the 23andMe website, if you go to their science page, all the way at the bottom in fine print, it does say, we use qualitative genotyping to detect clinically relevant variants in the genomic DNA of adults from saliva collected using FDA-cleared collection device, which just means the tube you spit into is FDA approved. For the purpose of reporting and interpreting genetic health risks and reporting carrier status. It is not intended to diagnose any disease. The relevance of each report may vary based on ethnicity. And this, all of this sort of disclaimer information, but again, even 23andMe, which is
better than most, it's this tiny little paragraph at the bottom of a page you have to search for. So transparency is one of the big, like again, I'm not in principle against this at all. If the companies are being transparent about exactly what you're getting and what you're giving up, right, when you submit a sample to them. What are you getting back and what are they gaining? Because there are so many things today where you're the product, right? And for Origin, the Raven's DNA Day, the people submitting the samples were the product.
How much transparency do you think there actually is in some of these deals?
Oh, very little. Very, I mean, again, I'm a geneticist and I had trouble finding the information I wanted on these websites. And I'm a very savvy consumer, although I also am not gonna purchase one of these. But
You said no. I mean, there's, if you go to the bottom line of the bottom thing in the fine print, you could read it, but it's still written in such an ambiguous way that it's not clear what it really means. But I mean, I would assume that if you give a sample, they own your DNA, they're going to do the test they say they're going to do, but they own your DNA, so they can do some other tests in the future. They didn't say they couldn't, and you don't know what's going to happen with that. It's, I mean, it's caveat emptor. You just need to know. If you want to do it anyway, that's fine. You just should know, and I don't think people know generally.
oh, and there's one all the way at the back and then one here in the middle.
I'm just really curious to hear about the idea about the ancestry testing.
I can't actually hear you.
Out of range.
Out of range?
The mic's connecting to that speaker.
Oh, no. Oh, there.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. I was very curious to hear about the idea that the ancestry testing is actually very accurate, just because there's a lot I've heard about kind of the flaws in how the ancestry is tested, particularly when referring to, say, African Americans that are told they can pinpoint the specific tribe that their ancestry might be from, just due to like how recent the sampling has been. And just curious to hear more about whether that has changed, or just your opinions on how accurate that actually is in different ways of ancestry.
So I'm not sure about the profiles that they're using in any specific company. I know that on a research basis right now, there are certain labs that can really pinpoint ancestry very specifically to this little village in Germany versus that little village in Germany. Or Africa's always less sampled than the rest, but also getting better because they're doing more and more sampling. So it is possible to identify ethnic origin more specifically now than it ever has been, and I'm sure that's going to improve over time as more people are sampled. How much the companies are using that, I can't answer because I don't know.
Oh, there's one in there too. Go ahead.
Okay. You just touched on something a little earlier, and I'm interested in see what your reaction to it. So they can do additional tests that you don't know about. What happens if another clinically significant marker is discovered on you? Are they going to call you back and say, we have found this?
They don't call you back. Not only don't they call you back, but there's a paper that published about 1.5 years ago about alleged superheroes who have two very severe pathogenic variants in a gene that should give them a disease, and they don't seem to have a disease because they came through one of these consumer companies, but they could not recontact any of those people to retest them. So, what? So I know they won't. They don't. Sometimes they can't. I mean, I think there's probably levels of. Again, I haven't done this, so I don't know. I haven't looked at every company. There may be permissions that they give you, but in general, no, they're not going to recontact you, and they don't want the liability for recontacting you if they find something. So you could probably recontact them or reanalyze your data that they give you access to, but they're not going to find you.
For another $199.
Well, and so anybody who's done 23andMe in the audience should speak up. Because I do think that, and I don't know, all these companies have different, they work differently. My sense is that 23andMe, your major interface with them is a website. And so I think when they add things, they do update their website to change what your results might say. And I don't, maybe they send you an email that says that they've updated your results. And so somebody in the audience talk about it.
Let's talk really loudly. Yeah, when they updated, or when they were able to do these new health reports, they sent out an email saying, oh, this is a great new thing that we can now tell you about. And they had
They being 23andMe specifically.
Yes, yeah, they'll send out your email that's associated with your account. And they, for that one specifically, because there was this FDA action against it, they had 2 little consent pages that you had to go through also. I wouldn't say that they were particularly thorough, but it was basically saying, this is the information that we're going to tell you. Do you want that? Yes. Are you sure you want that? Yes. And then you're pumped over to it.
And one other thing I'll add is that, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the flux in these companies, and my second slide was a bunch of companies, many of which don't exist anymore, right? What happens to your sample when the company you sent it to goes under or is bought by another company? That is something you should consider as well.
The comment about the interface of these testing and insurance was interesting. I had a question. If 23andMe shows you have a BRCA mutation carrier, do you have to disclose that if you're applying for life insurance? Or because it's not TIA certified, you can ignore it?
So technically, yes. They ask you to share with them any information you have about personal or family history of disease. So if you came to a genetic counselor to talk about your risks, and particularly if it's a, let's say, later onset neurologically devastating condition that you want testing for, we would tell you, please go buy your life insurance, please go buy your long-term care insurance, please go buy whatever else you think you need before you have this testing done, because once it's done, it's done. And whether it's part of your record or not, if you honestly answer the questions that life insurance and long-term care insurers ask you, which is what you're supposed to do, then the answer is, oh yeah, actually I have this variant and I'm going to get this disease. They're either not going to insure you or they're going to insure you for an incredibly much higher price. So you're absolutely right that it's not in the record, but on the other hand, so I have a real problem with all of these things as medical direct-to-consumer, just because I know how misinformed everybody is about everything. No, which is not to say that if you talk to somebody it's going to be perfect, but at least you know what we know and what we don't know and what we might learn. So Ancestry is fun, but the rest worries me. And no, you're supposed to tell the truth, actually. And you can be legally liable for not telling the truth.
Yes, not just morally.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to this question. Anyone in the audience who's done 23andMe, did they say in the process of purchasing anything about insurance? No, they did not say anything about insurance. Okay. So people presumably going into this would not know that, and certainly aren't prompted to think about what their insurance looks like and what their access to insurance might look like should they get a result back saying, for example, that they have a mutation that increases their risk of developing Parkinson's disease, which is one of the tests that 23andMe does.
So just anecdotally, my boyfriend did 23andMe, so obviously as a genetic counselor, after the first few days, I was like, hey, I want to see those results. But he actually did them before the FDA shut 23andMe down, and it had a bunch of different risks on it, and then suddenly all of that information was just gone. Like he couldn't log into his account while the FDA thing was happening, and now it looks completely different, and you can't find any of the past results that you had. So I think it's an interesting conversation with people who had the old 23andMe and got all of these risk assessments that aren't there anymore.
That's really interesting.
Well,
Yeah.
the good news about the new version is MTHFR is off it. Okay, because people, there's a particular variant. Yeah, there's a particular variant in a gene called MTHFR that in theory, only in theory, increases your risk of clotting. It's incredibly prevalent. The risk is extraordinarily small, but people would come and say, I have this MTHFR variant, please may I see it? We actually have on our website for our clinic, you know, if you're talking about MTHFR, please do not talk to us. It will not be quick, because it doesn't mean anything. But you know, and it's really a problem, because if somebody thinks that they've got something that diagnoses them or that puts them at increased risk, they're very anxious about that. You know, and I've actually had a patient come to me who had some variants on, and I don't remember which company it was, on some testing that she was convinced she had a condition called maple syrup urine disease. Well, maple syrup urine disease is a pretty severe condition. It usually manifests in the newborn period. This is an adult woman. She'd then gone and gotten some nutrigenomic variants that further, testing that further suggested that there was something different about her leucine. So she was sure, she was absolutely convinced. oh my gosh, what I have to do to dissuade her. I mean, it was like an hour and a half visit to say, no, actually, can you please not worry about this? But I am worried about that you keep fainting, can we work that up? You know, it was really very hard. So anyway, it's caveat emptor, and be careful.
Piggyback off the question about insurance, do we know of any efforts that are currently going on? So I'm sure insurance companies would like to perhaps know some of this data. Is there any, do we know of anything between any of these companies and any of the insurance companies that exist, or?
Not that I'm aware of, and the last that I heard, insurance companies actually didn't want this information. Yeah, because they can't interpret it either. Although, I will take this opportunity to bring up, so there is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which prevents the use of genetic information, which is very broadly defined, in the context of health insurance and employment. Right, the health insurance piece was largely superseded by the Affordable Care Act, although the status of that is now in question. But as part of the original passage of the ACA, there was a tremendous amount of leeway given to wellness programs. And wellness programs, for example, at universities. And there is currently HR 1313, which is a bill that's being proposed in the House that would allow wellness programs to use genetic information. That includes something that wellness programs are allowed to do under the ACA is provide incentives or disincentives to employees to participate in the wellness program. So your employer can say to you, I will give you $300 if a bonus if you get this genetic test done. If HR 1313 passes, that is something they could now say. Wellness programs are often run by outside contractors, which are not HIPAA-covered entities, etc. So that is something I'm actually quite worried about right now. Genetic testing in the context of wellness programs, if this particular bill passes. But generally, insurance companies don't want it.
Any other questions?
It is 23andMe's business plan to sell their information. Well, it's not clear to who they plan to sell it, and I presume it would be, blinded in terms of who the particular person is, but their genetic data and their phenotypic data they plan to sell to drug companies and the like.
And they are publishing on their research data. Extensively. Yeah, extensively.
So join me in thanking our panel for their and we'll look forward to seeing you next month on the third Tuesday for our next ethics village.